A 76-year-old man sat down in front of camera and did something most people in football spend entire careers carefully avoiding. He named names, 9 of them. 9 players he says he couldn't stand. No faking. No comment. No PR handler whispering in his ear to soften the edges. Just a list delivered flat and final, the way you'd read out a shopping receipt. That's Lou Macari for you. Before we get into who made the cut, you need to understand who's doing the naming, because this isn't some pundit chasing engagement with a spicy hot take. This is a man who won trophies at both Celtic and Manchester United, who managed multiple clubs across 2 different countries, and who was forged, hardwired really, inside one of the most ruthless, unforgiving dressing rooms in the history of British football. That dressing room belonged to Jock Stein. Stein's Celtic didn't do excuses. It didn't do social media, because there wasn't any yet, but the mentality maps almost perfectly onto how Macari still talks about the modern game decades later. Silence was strength. Doing the job without complaint was the entire job description. If you got injured, you found a way to play through it. If the manager tore into you in front of the whole squad, you took it standing up, because questioning him publicly wasn't just disrespectful. It was unthinkable, career-ending, the kind of thing that simply did not happen. Think about the era for a second. There was no agent fielding calls from rival clubs, no Instagram post to control the narrative, no players' union with the kind of teeth it has today. If Stein decided you were finished at the club, you were finished, and there wasn't much of a mechanism to argue otherwise. Macari came through that system, thrived inside it, won under it, and came out the other side with a set of values that worked perfectly for the world he was living in at the time. The problem is that the world kept moving after he stopped playing. Wages exploded. Free agency arrived. Global fame turned footballers into personal brands worth more off the pitch than most people will earn in a lifetime on it. And Macari, by his own repeated framing and interviews over the years, never fully made peace with any of it. Macari absorbed every bit of that old code, and he's been measuring the rest of football against it ever since. So when he says he hated 9 players across 2 different generations of the game, what he's really doing is drawing a hard line between 2 footballing worlds. The one he came up in and the one that exists right now. Richer, louder, individualized, and a lot less willing to shut up and absorb whatever's thrown at it. Let's start the countdown. Number 9. Sancho's spot on the list surprises people at first, mostly because his offense, in Macari's eyes, wasn't laziness or a bad attitude on the training pitch. His offense was that he answered back. When his Manchester United manager publicly criticized his standards, describing him as the worst trainer at the club in front of the media, Sancho didn't stay quiet and absorb it the old way. He pushed back in public, disputing the version of events being put out about him, and refusing to let the story stand unchallenged. To Macari's generation, that's close to the cardinal sin. You do not contradict the manager in public, ever, regardless of whether you believe you're right. But flip the frame for a second and look at the incentives involved. A young player, publicly named and effectively shamed by his own employer in front of a global audience, chose to defend his own reputation rather than let an unchallenged narrative define the rest of his career. In an era where a player's image is also his livelihood, his brand, his future contracts, his earning power for the next decade, is defending yourself really evidence a character flaw? Or is it just self-preservation, a survival instinct that simply didn't exist as an option back in 1967, when the manager's word was gospel and there was no camera crew waiting outside to ask for your side of it? Marshall's inclusion comes down to something that sounds almost old-fashioned itself: inconsistency. Flashes of genuine brilliance surrounded by long, frustrating stretches of anonymity. Injuries that piled up at conveniently disruptive moments across nearly every single season. A broader sense, fair or not, deserved or not, that the talent never got fully converted into results. Macari's issue here isn't really about raw ability, because nobody's disputing Marshall has serious technical gifts. It's about output measured against potential, judged against a career where Macari squeezed every last drop out of whatever ability he had, because there was no alternative path available to him. No release clause to hide behind. No loan move safety net to disappear into when things got difficult. You performed, or you were simply gone, replaced, forgotten. Marshall, to his credit, possesses talent that plenty of academies across Europe would kill to develop properly. Whether that talent was ever nurtured, managed, or deployed consistently across half a dozen different managerial regimes at Old Trafford is a separate question entirely. One that Macari's binary framing of effort versus laziness doesn't really leave any room to ask. Here's where the generational gap gets its sharpest edge yet. During a genuinely difficult run of goalless form, Lingard leaned into social media, dance videos, a public persona, active engagement with fans and followers online. To an audience raised on the assumption that a footballer's private time was actually private, it read as tone-deaf, badly timed, almost disrespectful to the shirt. To Macari, it reads as proof of misplaced priorities entirely. Here's the mock fair moment, because there has to be one somewhere in a list like this. It isn't unreasonable to expect a player going through a rough patch to read the room a little better, to understand how certain choices land publicly during a slump. Optics genuinely do matter in a results business. But it's also worth asking why a player entertaining himself off the pitch during a difficult run gets treated as damning evidence of a broken work ethic, when plenty of Macari's own generation drank hard, gambled harder, and lived considerably louder lives than anything you'll ever see on a modern Instagram feed. They just didn't have a smartphone camera pointed at them the entire time. This is the one that tends to get people typing before the sentence even finishes. Rashford spent a stretch of his career campaigning on child food poverty, publicly pressuring the government over school meal policy, using the size of his platform for something that had nothing to do with football whatsoever. Macari's discomfort here isn't really about Rashford's form or his finishing in front of goal. It's about the underlying idea of a footballer functioning as a political actor, a spokesperson, someone whose voice is allowed to extend past the touchline and into rooms footballers weren't traditionally invited into. In the world Macari came up in, players played football, full stop, and everything else was somebody else's job entirely. That framing ages badly the moment you actually look at what the campaign achieved. Reporting at the time credited the pressure with helping extend a food voucher scheme through school holidays, real policy movement that most footballers never attempt to cross an entire career, let alone in their early 20s. Whatever you think of Rashford's touch on the ball this season, dismissing that kind of platform use as a distraction rather than a legitimate use of influence says a lot more about the person doing the dismissing than it does about Rashford himself. There's a pattern building already across just the first few names on this list, and it's worth naming it directly before we go any further. None of these players committed what most fans would consider a genuine footballing crime. Nobody threw a match. Nobody assaulted a teammate. The offenses here are almost entirely offenses against an unwritten code of silence and deference. A code that made sense in a sport with no free agency and no direct line to the public, and that arguably makes a lot less sense in one with both. Pogba's entry circles back to a single moment Macari has referenced more than once in interviews. Pogba handing a shirt to an opposition player immediately after a defeat. To eyes trained on decades of, you don't fraternize with the enemy, that gesture reads as disrespect to the badge, to the fans in the stadium, to the result itself. Handing over your shirt right after a loss looks, in that worldview, like a man who's already made peace with losing before the final whistle even settles. Here's the counter read, though, and it's worth taking seriously. Post-match shirt swaps have been a fixture of professional football for generations. A sign of mutual respect between players who understand exactly how hard the other side worked, a tradition that predates Macari's own playing career by decades. The difference now is that every single gesture gets filmed from 6 angles, clipped within minutes, and dissected in real time by an audience stripped of context, turning a routine act of sportsmanship into a referendum on a man's entire character. Pogba swapping a shirt isn't new. An audience watching it happen live and deciding what it reveals about his soul. That part is new. This one's older, and it's personal in a very different way, because Macari actually managed him directly. Van Hooijdonk's contract standoff at Celtic, effectively refusing to play as leverage in a pay dispute, is remembered by Macari as one of the more damaging examples of a player placing himself above the collective interest of the club. There's a genuinely fair argument buried in here. A striker refusing to take the pitch does hurt the team, full stop, and Van Hooijdonk's methods were confrontational by any measure, then or now. But it's also true that this exact type of standoff became far more common and far more legally defensible once free movement rulings reshaped how much leverage a club could actually hold over a contracted employee. Van Hooijdonk was early to that fight, uncomfortably early in Macari's eyes at the time, but the economics of the sport eventually caught up to validate almost exactly the kind of leverage he was reaching for. McAvenny's inclusion is less about one flashpoint and more about a lifestyle, a striker who, by his own admission over the years in various interviews, embraced the celebrity side of the game as hard as the football itself. Nights out, tabloid front pages, a persona built as much around fame as around goals scored. Macari's generation saw football as labor first, with the entertainment side a distant, almost embarrassing second. McAvenny, whether by instinct or by design, seemed to understand something the wider sport wouldn't fully catch up to for another 2 decades. That football was already becoming an entertainment product, that fame was already a form of currency, and that a player leaning into that reality wasn't betraying the game so much as arriving early to a shift that would eventually swallow the entire sport whole, sponsorship deals and all. Dix earns his place for something closer to an old-school football sin, a reputation as one of the hardest, most physically uncompromising defenders of his generation, someone who racked up more cautions and dismissals than most of his peers, and whom Macari has framed as a player whose aggression regularly crossed from competitive into reckless territory. There's less of a sympathetic reframe available here, and it's worth saying that plainly rather than manufacturing balance where the balance doesn't really exist. Discipline on the pitch matters, and a defender who repeatedly put opponents at physical risk isn't a victim of changing football culture. He's simply a player whose approach carried real, tangible consequences for the people across from him. And here's where the list stops being about 9 random names and starts being about Macari himself. Because McStay isn't just another entry he happened to dislike. McStay is the player sitting at the center of the single most consequential relationship of Macari's entire managerial career. To understand why McStay tops this list, you have to rewind to 1993, when Macari left his job managing Stoke City to take charge of Celtic, the club he'd once played for as a boy, the club whose jersey he'd idolized long before he ever wore it professionally. McStay, by that point, wasn't just a player. He was Celtic's captain, a homegrown midfielder, a symbol of continuity for a club that had spent years mired in boardroom turmoil. And according to multiple accounts from that period, the relationship between the incoming manager and his own captain fractured almost immediately. Before we get to exactly what happened, it's worth stepping back and asking the bigger question this whole list has been building toward. Why does one man's set of grievances line up so neatly, generation after generation, around the exact same theme? Silence, sacrifice, total deference. Every single name on this list, in one way or another, represents a player who exercised some form of autonomy Macari's own generation never had access to: a voice, a platform, a legal right to walk, a choice about how loudly to live. That's not a coincidence. That's a worldview built brick by brick inside Jock Stein's Celtic, where the manager's authority was absolute and total commitment wasn't a virtue. It was simply the minimum bar for staying employed. Macari has spent decades applying that exact bar to every player who came after him, treating any deviation from it: a public rebuttal, a charity campaign, a shirt swap, a dance video, as evidence of a generation that's lost something essential. It's worth asking, though, whether what's actually been lost is a set of values or simply a set of conditions that no longer exist. Total obedience made a certain kind of sense when the alternative to obedience was unemployment with no safety net. It makes a different kind of sense now, in a sport worth billions of pounds annually, where players have union protections, legal representation, and global platforms of their own. Judging today's players by yesterday's constraints isn't really a measure of character. It's a category error dressed up as a moral one, which makes what happened next in Macari's own career almost too fitting to be real. Before we get to exactly what happened, it's worth stepping back and asking the bigger question this whole list has been building toward. Why does one man's set of grievances line up so neatly, generation after generation, around the exact same theme? Silence, sacrifice, total deference. Every single name on this list, in one way or another, represents a player who exercised some form of autonomy Macari's own generation never had access to: a voice, a platform, a legal right to walk, a choice about how loudly to live. That's not a coincidence. That's a worldview, built brick by brick inside Jock Stein's Celtic, where the manager's authority was absolute and total commitment wasn't a virtue. It was simply the minimum bar for staying employed. Macari has spent decades applying that exact bar to every player who came after him, treating any deviation from it, a public rebuttal, a charity campaign, a shirt swap, a dance video, as evidence of a generation that's lost something essential. It's worth asking, though, whether what's actually been lost is a set of values or simply a set of conditions that no longer exist. Total obedience made a certain kind of sense when the alternative to obedience was unemployment with no safety net. It makes a different kind of sense now, in a sport worth billions of pounds annually, where players have union protections, legal representation, and global platforms of their own. Judging today's players by yesterday's constraints isn't really a measure of character. It's a category error dressed up as a moral one, which makes what happened next in Macari's own career almost too fitting to be real. Reports from that Celtic dressing room in 1993 describe a training ground disagreement between Macari and McStay that escalated well past a normal clash of footballing opinions. Account from the time reference a heated exchange over instructions during a session, a confrontation serious enough that it came to define the rest of Macari's short, turbulent spell in charge of the club. Whatever the precise blow-by-blow of that argument, the outcome was unmistakable. The relationship between the manager and his captain was never repaired, and it cast a long shadow over everything Macari tried to build at Celtic Park. Now here's the twist: the countdown format never tells you outright, but the timeline makes almost impossible to ignore. Macari reportedly took the Celtic job while still keeping his family home down in Stoke-on-Trent, commuting north rather than relocating to Glasgow full-time. To a fan base and a football culture more broadly that measures commitment in blood and soil terms. You live where the club lives, you bleed the colors every single day, you don't clock in from 300 miles away. That detail simply didn't sit right. It didn't sit right with the board either. Macari was dismissed from the Celtic job within a year of taking it, and what followed didn't stay inside football at all. It spilled into a courtroom. Macari pursued a claim for wrongful dismissal. Celtic side countered that he had failed to meet the basic commitment and residency terms of his own contract from the very start. The Court of Session in Scotland ultimately ruled against Macari, finding that he had been in breach of his contract's obligations. The very qualities Macari has spent decades demanding from 9 different players across 2 footballing generations: total presence, total commitment, no divided loyalties, no distractions pulling focus away from the club. A court of law found he himself had not fully delivered in the one job where that exact standard was finally being applied to him instead of to the people underneath him. And the irony doesn't stop at the verdict itself. Think about what Macari had spent his entire managerial approach demanding up to that point. Players who lived near the training ground, players who put the club above personal convenience, players who didn't let outside distractions pull focus from the job. Every one of those demands applied consistently to the squad he inherited at Celtic Park. And then, according to the very court tasked with adjudicating the dispute, the man making those demands hadn't relocated his own life to meet the same bar he was setting for everyone else. Sit with that for a second, because it's the whole engine driving this entire story. A man builds his entire footballing worldview around sacrifice, presence, and silent obedience to the badge above everything else. He applies that standard publicly and repeatedly to 9 different players spanning 2 generations, judging their loyalty, their focus, their commitment to the cause every step of the way. And when he's finally the one being measured against that exact yardstick, not in a locker room this time, But under oath, in front of judge, he comes up short by the very metric he spent his entire post-playing career using to judge everyone else. That's not hypocrisy in the cheap, gotcha, viral clip sense. It's something closer to a genuine tragedy. A man utterly convinced he's the last remaining guardian of a code that, when actually tested under legal scrutiny, he couldn't fully live up to himself. To be fair for a second, because it matters here, none of this makes Macari a villain in any cartoonish sense. People who worked alongside him during his playing and management days consistently describe someone who genuinely believed in the values he still preaches today, not someone performing manufactured outrage for a camera the way plenty of modern pundits do for a living. His career achievements are real. His medals are real. The football his teams won under his direction is real, and it mattered to the people who lived through it. And there's a part of his story that rarely gets attached to the viral clips doing the rounds online. For years, Macari has quietly supported charitable work helping homeless people in Stoke, running efforts that have provided food, shelter support, and practical help to people the football world usually looks straight past without a second glance. That's not the footnote you'd expect from a man reduced online to nothing more than grumpy ex-pro hates modern players. So where does that leave the whole picture once you step back from the individual names? Maybe the real story here was never actually about 9 players at all. Maybe it's about one man's slow-motion grief for a version of football that simply doesn't exist anymore. A version where loyalty felt simple because players had almost no leverage to begin with, where silence read as strength because there was no other realistic option on the table, where the manager's word was final because there was nowhere else to go if you happened to disagree with it. The Bossman ruling blew that entire world open in the mid-1990s, arriving right around the same period Macari's own Celtic tenure was collapsing in on itself. Suddenly players had freedom of movement at the end of their contracts, real bargaining power at the negotiating table, the ability to walk away when their deal expired instead of being tied indefinitely to a club that no longer needed them. Social media blew the walls open again roughly a decade after that, handing players a direct line to millions of fans without a newspaper editor or a club press officer standing in the middle, controlling the narrative on their behalf. Macari watched both of those walls come down in real time, from the inside of the game, rather than as a distant observer. And every single name on that list of 9 is, in some form or another, a player who exists comfortably inside a footballing world Macari's own generation never had access to. More freedom of movement, more of a public voice, more control over their own image and their own career trajectory than a Celtic player under Jock Stein could ever have dreamed of asking for. Calling it hate might genuinely be the wrong word for what Macari's actually describing when he sits down and rattles off 9 names without blinking. It might just be mourning dressed up as a grievance list because a 76-year-old football man was never really handed the vocabulary to say, "I don't recognize this world anymore," without it sounding to his own ear like weakness. And that's worth remembering the next time a headline reduces a complicated life into a tidy countdown of 9 grievances. The list isn't really about Sancho or Marshall or Lingard or Rashford or Pogba or Van Hooijdonk or McAvenny or Dix or even McStay specifically. It's about the gap between the football Macari played inside Jock Stein's Celtic and the football being played today, a gap measured not in tactics or fitness levels, but in who actually holds the power and who gets to speak. There's also a broader pattern here that extends well past one man's list. Every generation of football produces its own version of Lou Macari, a former player, decorated and credible, who looks at the players coming up behind him and sees not talent, but decline, not adaptation, but decay. It happened to the generation before Stein's players too, and it will happen again to whichever generation is currently in its prime 20 years from now, looking at whoever comes after them. The specifics change. The shape of the complaint almost never does. What happens next for Macari at 76 probably isn't another list. It's more interviews, more of the same worldview delivered with the same flat certainty, because that worldview isn't a performance for the cameras. It's simply who the man is, formed decades before any of the players on his list ever kicked a professional ball. The next controversy involving him likely won't be far behind, and it will likely follow the exact same pattern. An old-school standard applied to a modern player who was never given the same rules to play by, judged by a man who, when his own turn came under those exact rules, found out in a Scottish courtroom just how hard they actually were to live up to. So here's the actual question worth sitting with, and it's bigger than any list of 9 names could ever be. When a member of the old guard judges the modern player, are we genuinely hearing a defensible standard of professionalism? Or are we hearing a generation grieving the loss of its own authority, dressed up as a critique of somebody else's character? Where do you land on it? Drop your take, your verdict, in the comments below. I read every single one. A like genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think. So if you got something out of this, tap it before you go. And subscribe if you want more of this. The stories sitting underneath the headlines. The ones the highlight reels never bother to show you. Football at this scale is never just a tournament. It's a moment in time.